I've made a lot of Japanese related things this year. For example, probably the first thing that comes to mind is the cherry blossom tree that I made in order to have my own hanami. If you follow my TikTok, you've also seen my Thanksgiving Japanese food dinner where I made a bunch of different Japanese food dishes for Friendsgiving. But over the holiday season, I wanted to kick it up a notch. Now, one of the things that I feel like is the most Japanese thing are bentos. It's just like the perfect combination of a bunch of different kinds of foods in a fancy little box, and you have such a variety of things that you get to eat within your meal. It's portable, all the recipes are usually pretty easy to make, and it's just delicious. すごく便利だと思う. So as I was thinking of things to give to my friends for Christmas, I thought, why not give them a bento box? But I wanted to put a little bit of spin on it. So I decided to try and make a very beautiful, very aesthetic dessert bento box.
マトカが参ります。ご注意ください。
Now I ended up using 3 different recipes to fill the bento box, and I will share them in the description below. But I feel like I need to make a note that I'm not a professional chef. I'm just some dude trying to follow a bunch of recipes, and if it kind of turns out shit, I'm not going to edit the footage or like remake it or anything like that. So it kind of just turned out how it turned out. I'm not saying that anything turned out bad. You can see at the very end what my bento box looked like. But if you go over to like Tasty Japan's channel or any other cooking channel, like when you see their video quality and the quality of the food that they make, if there's just one little thing wrong, they redo the whole recipe just so they can get that perfect shot. And I don't have the luxury to actually do that, so don't get your hopes up. But I took a few different recipes that I found on YouTube as well as some family recipes and kind of just made them my own because I really wanted to make this work. So this is almost like a challenge to prove that I can actually bake and make something that is aesthetic and tolerable to eat. But we have a few different recipes to get into, so let's just start now. We're starting off with a real simple recipe, and they are called Christmas balls. It's a very nutty cookie, and it doesn't take up very much ingredients. I think one of the best things about this recipe is that it really doesn't have that much sophistication, just with these few ingredients. So the first thing you're going to want to do is sift together the flour, sugar, and salt into a large bowl. Sifting is really important. You want to make sure that there aren't any clumps in your flour, your sugar, and your salt. And you're just going to be using a whisk in order to mix all of these ingredients together. You're then going to be adding your 2 sticks of butter along with the vanilla to your flour mixture. Now make sure that you're using salted butter instead of unsalted butter, and it really helps if you have the butter at room temperature before you start kneading it into the flour mixture. It just makes the whole process a lot easier, and you might even want to use your hands in this occasion, but you want to make sure that it turns into a dough-like texture. You're then going to be adding your 2 cups of chopped nuts. Make sure that they're the regular chopped nuts instead of the finely chopped nuts because you're going to be using those other nuts a little bit later. I ended up using my hands for most of this just because using a spoon or a spatula is just too much work and doesn't get the consistency that you really want. Then you want to use a ice cream scooper or just like a small scooper in general to shape the balls into about 1 teaspoon sizes for each. You're also going to roll them in the finely chopped nuts. And then you're going to have your baking sheet filled with parchment paper and place your cookies next to each other. You don't have to space them too far because they're not going to expand or rise. Yeah, I know they pretty much look exactly the same as they come out of the oven, but this timing is very important. You want to make sure that your cookies are super hot when you're going to cover them in powdered sugar. You want the powdered sugar to kind of melt over the cookies as well. Personally, I would say be super generous with using the powdered sugar because there's not much sugar in the recipe, in the dough itself, so a lot of the sweetness is going to come from the coating. And there you have it. That's freaking beautiful. This next one is a MATOKA original, just super easy, super simple, with an infused black tea provided by Violet. If you haven't checked out Kin Leaf Tea before, you really need to do that. But I'm going to infuse the black tea with some box cake mix. Cake mix, pretty simple, pretty easy. Just read the back. You can do it on your own. I'm not going to provide any instructions on that. The only thing I'm gonna say is instead of adding the water, I added black tea instead and mixed that shit around. The inspiration for this recipe mainly is just because of these flower molds that I got. I got them at Michael's. They were pretty cheap and they are pretty cool just to make nice designs for your cakes or cupcakes or anything like that. So I wanted to try it out. And there we go. It's looking very cupcakey, but once we take it out of the mold, beautiful. 綺麗だった. So now we have our flour molded cakes. I had to cut the bottoms off just to make sure that the flour would lay flat and so that it would fit in the bento box in the first place, because that's the whole point of all these recipes. I ended up making an icing by adding a little bit of vanilla to a little bit of milk and adding a lot of powdered sugar. It's a pretty simple icing recipe that you can find online, but I kind of didn't really do any major measurements for it, so I can't really give you any tips on that. Just make sure to mix it well, and to add a bit of pizzazz, I wanted to have two different types of frosting, and I didn't really want to flavor it, so the only thing I did was add some food coloring so that I would have some roses that were pink and some roses that were white. Now if I had to go back and redo this recipe, one thing I would say is you might not want to waste your time with brewing tea in order to put into the cakes, because with cake box mix you can't really taste it in the first place. And the other thing is, for the frosting, if you leave it out too long on top of the cake, a lot of it melts or kind of absorbs into the cake itself. So maybe using a different frosting recipe might help. Now this final recipe, of course, is the showstopper, and I got this from Chocolate Cacao's channel on YouTube. It's called a natural red flesh apples tart cake. Now this is a Japanese channel and he works a lot with chocolate and just like beautiful desserts in general, and it's pretty easy because the crust is made with puff pastry. I'm not gonna go through the whole process that is in Chocolate Cacao's video, because I think you should watch it if you want to see the original version of the recipe, just because I made a few adjustments for my own. But just like the original recipe, I used a pre-made puff pastry in order to create the crust. Now one of the deviations that I had to make from the original recipe was the apples that I used. I could not find these natural red flesh apples that are actually red on the inside, so instead I dyed some water red and had the apples sit, and when I thinly sliced them, actually the dye soaked into the apples pretty well and kind of replicated that natural red flesh apple tone on the inside. The other deviation was for the almond cream filling, and I used my own recipe for that instead of what was provided in the video. So I'll make sure to share the recipe that I used for what is known as a frangipane. Am I saying that incorrectly? 5 billion%. But make sure, because it has raw egg in it, that you need to bake it with the crust. I think the only difference is in the original recipe, they bake the crust first and then they bake the almond filling in intervals. I baked it all together and it seemed to work perfectly fine. I couldn't really find an easy way to put the almond filling in the actual pie crust besides using a spoon and basically my fingers the whole time. But one thing that I did want to do is add parchment paper inside of the tart so that it covers the frangipane, because you do want to add pie weights onto your pie onto your tart just because you don't want the puff pastry to rise so that you're able to fill it. And it worked pretty well. I used the same apple filling recipe in the original video in order to make the apple filling for this. The only thing that I skipped out on was making the chocolate top that you'll see in the original video. And I just went straight into making the roses for the top of the tart. Now if you look at my apple slices, turned out pretty red, and I think I put about 2 or 3 drops of food coloring in it for that shade of red that I actually achieved. So you can pretty much use any apple that is just like bland on the inside and use food coloring in order to imitate that red flesh kind of color. And here's how it turned out. Also pretty freaking beautiful, if I do say so myself. The final step was to put everything in the bento box, and I got this specific bento box in San Francisco, Japantown at a store called Soko Hardware. It's a hardware store, but they have so many different Japanese items there that you can find. They have bento boxes, they have the paper lanterns, they have rice cookers, and just so many different things. So I highly recommend that you check it out if you're just looking for any Japanese tools that you need. The Snowball cookies turned out to be great fillers between the cakes and for some of the compartments that I wasn't able to utilize very well. But overall, it turned out pretty freaking aesthetic in my opinion, and all I needed to do was wrap it with one of these bandanas that I found from Daiso as well. The bento box that I got didn't come with a strap to keep everything together, so I highly recommend if you don't have a strap for your bento box that you actually use a cloth to cover it like this, just because it really keeps everything stable, make sure nothing spills out, and it just looks a lot more traditional as well.
Hey, I hope I don't open it wrong. Okay. Oh my god, it's so cute! It's a chocolate too!
Yeah.
Wait, there's food in it! There's food in it! Wait, how am I supposed to eat this? Oh my god, it's
So it's a dessert bento box.
Oh my god! No, you can't. Stop looking at it. It's fine.
And that's the bento box that I made. Honestly, these recipes are pretty easy. I think the hardest one was the tart for sure, because I kind of just had to go with my gut and feel like what would taste good together and that kind of thing. But there is a whole YouTube video where you can follow that recipe as well. I think it's a little more intricate, and of course it looks a lot better than what I made, but I think the flower roses is probably the highlight, and anyone can make that. But I highly recommend trying this at home, even if you're not putting it in a bento box. It's pretty just aesthetic to put on a plate and give to your friends and just have them be in awe. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you like this random idea that I did have, and make sure to like the video if you like content like this. I do plan on making more Japanese cooking videos and stuff like that in the future. I feel like 2022 is coming, and I feel much more rejuvenated to start making content for the channel again. So thank you for everyone who's been waiting. If you're still subscribed and you got that notification bell on, thank you. You were the highlight of my 2021 for damn sure. And yeah, if you're not subscribed and you haven't hit that notification bell, make sure to do that. Also follow me on my other socials, MATOKA Milk Tea, pretty much everywhere else besides YouTube now. And I will see you next time. Peace.